before David slew Goliath, before Moses parted the sea, before the walls of Jericho fell, before any of the great battles of the Bible were ever written down, there was this one. Genesis chapter 14. 9 kings, 5 city-states, a valley full of bitumen pits and burning cities. One man who, by every calculation of power and numbers, should not have won. This is not a parable. This is not a metaphor. This is a documented military campaign from the early Bronze Age, and the man at the center of it is the same man God would later call the father of nations. His name was Abram. He was living in a tent. He had 318 men, and he was about to go to war against the most powerful military coalition the ancient Near East had assembled in that region. Tonight, we are going back to the southern Levant, approximately 2,000 years before the birth of Christ, to the smoke-filled valley of Siddim, to a night raid that covered 150 miles of hill country and river valley, to a moment that would leave a 1,000-year echo across Scripture, because 5 kings made a catastrophic miscalculation. They took the wrong man's family. To understand what happens in Genesis 14, you have to understand the world it was written into, not the world of felt boards and Sunday school illustrations, the real world of the Middle Bronze Age. We are in the period between 2100 and 2000 BCE. What archaeologists confirm was marked by large-scale population movements, rising fortified city-states, and a complex network of interstate tribute and trade. The ancient Near East was not a collection of primitive mud hut villages. It was a web of sophisticated political powers, each with armies, scribes, treaties, and ambitions. In the east, rising from the Zagros mountain foothills of what is today southwestern Iran, the kingdom of Elam had emerged as a dominant military force. Elamite power ran on a specific strategy: project force across enormous distances, establish tribute relationships with weaker city-states, and return periodically to collect or to punish those who refused. Cuneiform records from this era document Elamite kings campaigning as far west as the Levantine corridor. This was not unusual. This was how power worked before empires had a name. In Mesopotamia, the cities of Shinar, ancient Sumer, and Akkad had their own rulers, their own armies, and their own reach. They formed coalitions. They coordinated long-range campaigns. They had the administrative infrastructure to sustain military operations across hundreds of miles. And in Canaan, in the southern lowland basin near the Dead Sea, 5 city-states had formed a loose confederation. Their names are recorded in Genesis with specificity: Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Bela, also called Zoar. 5 cities, 5 kings. One shared strategic asset: the Valley of Siddim, a rich and defensible lowland basin at the southern end of the Jordan Valley. These 5 cities had, for 12 years, paid tribute to Chedorlaomer, king of Elam. 12 years of submission. 12 years of sending wealth east to a king they had never chosen. It was the price of survival in a world where Elamite armies could march 800 miles and not run out of partners willing to join them. In the 13th year, the 5 kings stopped paying. That decision set in motion a chain of events that would end with a man named Abram standing north of Damascus, surrounded by recovered captives and plundered goods, being blessed by a priest-king whose name would echo through the next 3,000 years of history. But first, Chedorlaomer had to answer the rebellion. Chedorlaomer did not come alone. Genesis 14 names the Eastern Coalition precisely: Chedorlaomer of Elam, Amraphel of Shinar, Arioch of Elasar, and Tidal, identified as King of Nations, most likely commanding a confederacy of tribal groups. 4 crowns, 1 coordinated campaign, 1 objective: Make an example of the 5 Canaanite cities, and do it in a way that no one within 1,000 miles would forget. Their campaign route is one of the most geographically specific passages in the entire patriarchal narrative. Scholars have spent more than a century mapping it against known Bronze Age sites. The coalition descended from the northeast, cutting southward through the Transjordan. They struck the Rephaim at Ashtaroth Karnaim, the Zuzim at Ham, the Emim at Shaveh Kiriathaim. They swept southwest through Mount Seir, pushing all the way to El Paran near the Sinai. Then they reversed direction, coming back up the western corridor, striking the Amalekites at Kadesh and the Amorites at Hazazon Tamar. Read it on a map and the strategy is clear. This was not a raid. It was a comprehensive, pre-planned, sweep, systematic destruction of every potential ally, every source of resupply, every escape route available to the 5 Canaanite cities. Before the coalition ever turned toward Sodom and Gomorrah, it had encircled them entirely. No reinforcements were coming, no neighbouring power could intervene. When the 4 kings converged on the valley of Siddim, the 5 Canaanite kings had no realistic options. They formed their battle line anyway. They fought. The outcome was swift and brutal. 2 kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fell into the bitumen pits lining the Dead Sea Basin. Their armies scattered. The cities were looted. Their populations were taken captive and marched east. Among those captives, somewhere in that column of slaves and seized goods, was a man named Lot, the nephew of Abram. Here is where most people misread the story and where archaeology becomes essential. When we meet Abram in Genesis, he lives in tents, moves with his herds, and builds altars in open fields. The image most people carry is of a wandering shepherd, devout certainly, but not a man of military weight, not someone a regional king would fear. That picture is archaeologically wrong. In the ancient Near East, wealth was measured in livestock, servants, armed retainers, and alliances. A man who controlled herds large enough to require dozens of full-time workers was not a poor wanderer. He was the Bronze Age equivalent of a wealthy landowner with a private security force and a wide network of political relationships. When Genesis says Abram lived in the plains of Mamre near Hebron, it is giving us a strategic location. Hebron sits at nearly 3,000 feet above sea level, a defensible plateau in the southern hill country of Canaan with commanding views of the surrounding lowlands. Abram was not camping randomly. He was positioned on high ground, near covenant allies who were bound to him by mutual obligation. Those allies are named in the text: Mamre, Eshcol, and Aner, 3 Amorite chieftains in a covenant relationship with Abram. Not employees, covenant partners. In the Bronze Age, that meant if one partner suffered a loss, the others were required to respond with force. And then there is the number that changes the entire picture. Genesis 14 verse 14. Abram armed his trained men, his hanachim in the Hebrew, a word meaning initiated, dedicated, not drafted farmers, trained fighters, his own household retinue. The number given is 318. Egyptian administrative papyri from the Middle Kingdom document Canaanite and Levantine chieftains commanding household retinues of exactly this scale. Cuneiform tablets from Mari describe wealthy patriarchal figures maintaining armed escorts of similar size, trained for rapid military deployment. This was not exceptional. This was what a man of Abram's standing was expected to maintain. Abram was not a peasant who got lucky. He was a man of regional standing with trained fighters, covenant allies, and a military reputation his neighbours already respected. The fugitive who escaped the battle and brought news of Lot's capture did not go to the nearest tent. He ran to the right man. Abram moved fast. He armed his 318 trained men, gathered his 3 Amorite allies, and marched north from Hebron all the way to Dan, near the headwaters of the Jordan River in the far north of Canaan. The Eastern Coalition was retreating toward Mesopotamia. Abram had cut off their route. At Dan, he made the decision that separates a mob from a military force. He divided his men. The Hebrew word the text uses is vayechalek, he divided, a tactical term, a flanking maneuver. Dividing your forces against a numerically superior enemy only works if your units are disciplined enough to hold assignments in darkness. If officers understand the objective clearly enough to act independently, and if the timing of multiple columns is precise enough to hit before the enemy can reposition, Abram executed this at night. This is not the first time the tactic appears in Scripture. Gideon uses the same approach against the Midianites in Judges 7:3 columns, striking in darkness, creating chaos that made the enemy believe they were surrounded by a much larger force. Bronze Age military texts from Egypt describe this approach as established doctrine, not improvisation. Trained, rehearsed tactics. Abram hit the coalition at Dan and pursued them north to Hobah, north of Damascus, at least another 50 to 80 miles beyond the initial engagement. He did not stop until the retreat became a total rout. He recovered all the goods, all the people, every captive taken from the 5 cities. Lot was alive. When Abram marched south, 2 kings came out to meet him. The king of Sodom offered a deal. Take the goods, return the people, keep the wealth you earned. Abram refused. He would not take a sandal strap from the king of Sodom. His reason is one of the most striking lines in the patriarchal narrative. Lest you say, I have made Abram rich. He had not marched 150 miles and risked his household to build a political debt with Sodom. He would not let an earthly king become the author of his wealth or his reputation. The second king who came out was different in every way. His name was Melchizedek, king of Salem, the city most scholars identify with the site that would later become Jerusalem. He carried a title that appears nowhere else in the narrative at this point, priest of God Most High, El Elyon in the Hebrew. Not a local tribal deity, the God who possesses heaven and earth. Melchizedek brought bread and wine. He blessed Abram. He acknowledged God as the one who had delivered the enemies into Abram's hand, and Abram gave him 1/10 of everything. The first tithe recorded in all of Scripture, not commanded, not legislated, freely given by a man who had just won an impossible war to a priest whose origins the text deliberately leaves unstated. Something is being established here that the rest of Scripture will return to for 1,000 years. The geography of Genesis 14 has attracted more serious archaeological attention than almost any other passage in the patriarchal narratives, because it is specific enough to test against the physical landscape. The Valley of Siddim is traditionally identified with the southern basin of the Dead Sea. Geological surveys confirm that in the Bronze Age this area was significantly shallower. Large areas now underwater were once dry, cultivatable lowland. Ancient texts describe the region as full of bitumen pits, naturally occurring asphalt seeps from the tectonic activity of the Dead Sea Rift. Petroleum deposits matching this description have been confirmed along the current shoreline. The 5 cities have been searched for by archaeologists for over a century. The site receiving the most attention in recent decades is Tall el-Hammam, northeast of the Dead Sea in Jordan. Excavations have uncovered a massive, fortified Bronze Age city destroyed with extraordinary violence. The destruction layer contains vitrified pottery, melted mud brick, and fragmented bone, consistent with temperatures far beyond anything ancient siege technology could produce. Whether Tall el-Hammam is Sodom remains debated. What is no longer debated is that large, sophisticated, walled cities existed in exactly this region during exactly this period. Archaeological surveys of the Transjordan have identified Bronze Age settlement clusters at locations matching the named sites on the coalition's march route, followed by destruction layers consistent with a major military force sweeping through from north to south and back again. Abram's route north from Hebron covered territory he knew well. He had already emigrated from Ur to Haran, then through all of Canaan, then to Egypt and back. He knew the roads, the water sources, and the choke points. A man of his experience and movement history would not have needed a map to plan a 150-mile night pursuit. There is a temptation, when reading the Old Testament, to flatten the patriarchs into symbols. Abraham as faith, Isaac as obedience, Jacob as perseverance. We turn them into archetypes because archetypes are easier to teach, but Genesis 14 will not allow that. This is a chapter that names 9 kings, traces a specific military campaign through identifiable Bronze Age geography, records a precise troop count, names a tactical maneuver, and documents a political exchange between a victorious commander and a local priest-king. It is the most externally verifiable chapter in the entire patriarchal narrative. And what it verifies is not the kind of story an editor would have invented to make a theological point. Invented stories simplify their heroes. Genesis 14 complicates Abram. He has just defeated a coalition that subdued the entire southern Levant. He holds recovered wealth that could fund a decade of expansion. The path to regional power is directly in front of him, and he refuses it completely. He turns down the king of Sodom's offer with a statement of extraordinary self-awareness. He will not let Sodom write his story. He gives a tenth to a priest with no political leverage and no army, who serves a God identified only by his ownership of heaven and earth. The warrior returns home a herdsman, and the text does not treat this as a failure. It treats it as exactly right. That is a man who knows what he is and what he is not, and has chosen with total clarity where his identity comes from. Genesis 14 ends quietly. Abram returns to his tents. The kings return to their cities. The Eastern Coalition retreats toward Mesopotamia. The world moves on. But the text does not forget Melchizedek. 1,000 years after Abraham, the royal psalms invoke his priesthood as the defining title of the ideal king. You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. Every scholar of the ancient Near East who heard that line would have understood what was being claimed. This king's authority does not come from the ordinary structures of Israelite religious life. It reaches back further. It reaches back to the valley of Siddim and a man who brought bread and wine. In the New Testament, the writer of Hebrews spends 2 full chapters unpacking that single encounter in Genesis 14. The argument, Jesus Christ fulfills the Melchizedekian priesthood because he is a king priest whose authority does not depend on genealogy, whose service does not end at death, whose intercession is permanent and complete. One Bronze Age exchange between a victorious chieftain and an unnamed priest becomes the theological architecture for understanding the identity of Christ. That is a remarkable echo from a valley near the Dead Sea 2,000 years before the 1st century. And notice what the echo reveals. The writer of Hebrews is not inventing a new theology and reaching backward for a proof text. He is pointing to a moment that was already strange when it happened, a priest with no genealogy, a title that transcends ethnic boundaries, bread and wine, in the middle of a battlefield debriefing. The strangeness was always there. The New Testament writers simply followed the thread that Genesis itself had left hanging, deliberately and visibly, for 1,000 years. Here is what the evidence tells us at ground level, stripped of all theology held against Elamite and Mesopotamian cuneiform records. Egyptian administrative papyri, and the excavated tells of the southern Levant. A man named Abram, living in the hill country of Canaan in the early 2nd millennium BCE, received news that a Mesopotamian coalition had taken his nephew captive. He armed 318 trained fighters. He gathered 3 Amorite allies. He marched 150 miles north. He divided his forces and executed a coordinated night attack documented in Bronze Age military doctrine. He pursued the routed coalition north of Damascus. He recovered every captive and every piece of seized goods. He refused the reward from the king of Sodom, and he gave honor to a priest who acknowledged God as the source of the victory. Every detail is consistent with what we know from the Middle Bronze Age record. This is not mythology dressed up as history. The geography is too precise. The tactics are too technically accurate. The economics of patriarchal power are too well matched to what excavations and administrative records have confirmed. When you place the text of Genesis 14 alongside the archaeological and cuneiform evidence, the account does not collapse under scrutiny. It becomes more credible, more detailed, and more verifiable the closer you look, which is the opposite of what happens when you examine mythology. This is history, ancient, verifiable, documented history that turns out, on closer inspection, to be far stranger, far more specific, and far more significant than most people who have ever read this story ever stop to realize. The first great war of the Middle East was not fought by an emperor or a dynasty or a standing army with a national flag. It was fought by a man living in a tent with 318 trained men and 3 covenant allies. And he won. If this is the kind of truth you came here for, subscribe. We go deeper every time.